Right now, there's a voice in your head reading these words back to you. You didn't ask it to do that. It just does it. It's been doing it your whole life, so automatically, so constantly, that you've probably never once stopped to ask what it actually is, where it came from, or whether everyone has one. They don't. Somewhere between 5 and 10% of people move through their entire lives with almost no inner voice at all. No running commentary, no mental rehearsal, just silence where most of us have words. And until about a year ago, science didn't even have a name for it. But here's the stranger thing. The voice you do have, the one that feels like the most private, most intimate part of you, isn't really yours either. Let's start with what it actually is. When you talk to yourself silently, your brain does something that took scientists a long time to fully appreciate. It fires up almost exactly the same machinery it uses when you speak out loud. The same motor regions, the same language areas, the same auditory circuits that process real sound. Broca's area, a region in your left frontal lobe, activates. Your auditory cortex responds as if it's genuinely hearing something. Your brain is, in a very real sense, talking and listening to itself at the same time. Researchers call this the phonological loop. Think of it as a short-term rehearsal system, a scratch pad where you repeat things to keep them alive. When you silently repeat a phone number before you can write it down, that's the loop running. But here's what's strange. People who suffer specific brain injuries can lose their inner voice entirely while keeping their ability to speak out loud. The two systems are related, but they're not the same thing. The inner voice isn't just silent talking. It's its own distinct process, one your brain invented and one it can take away. So how often is it actually running? For decades, scientists mostly asked people about this using questionnaires. How often do you think in words? Very often, most people said. Almost constantly. Then a psychologist named Russell Hurlburt tried something different. He gave participants a small beeper that went off at random moments throughout the day. Each time it sounded, they had to record exactly what was in their mind at that precise instant, before they had time to think about their answer, before they could construct a story about themselves. What he found quietly dismantled the idea of a constant inner monologue. Inner speech, actual verbal thought, was only present in roughly a quarter to a third of sampled moments. And questionnaire studies, he showed, were overestimating how often people have inner speech by a factor of 2 to 4. The number people gave when asked abstractly was roughly double what was actually happening in real time. Most of your mental life isn't verbal at all. There's imagery, there's emotion, there's what Hurlburt calls unsymbolized thinking, knowing something without words or pictures, just a kind of direct, wordless understanding. The inner monologue you think is running constantly is more like a radio that keeps cutting out. Which raises a question most people never think to ask. If the inner voice isn't constant, and some people barely have one at all, where did it come from in the first place? In the 1930s, a Soviet psychologist named Lev Vygotsky made an observation that still holds up today. Watch a young child doing something difficult, a puzzle, building something, drawing, and you'll hear them narrate out loud to themselves. Now I put this here. Where does this go? That's not right. Vygotsky argued this wasn't immaturity, it wasn't random noise, it was self-guidance, and crucially, it increases when the task gets harder. The child is coaching themselves, using words borrowed from the people around them as a tool to organize their own thinking. Over time, that outer voice gets quieter. Then it becomes a whisper. Then it folds inward, disappearing entirely into what we now experience as inner speech. The voice in your head is other people's words, made private. But there's a darker theory about why it went silent. A researcher named Sean O'Connor proposed something that doesn't get talked about enough. Social speech, talking out loud, is cooperative, but it also broadcasts your plans to everyone around you. If you're thinking about deceiving someone, getting ahead of someone, taking something for yourself, talking out loud gets you caught.
His argument is that inner speech evolved, at least in part, as a way to hide. Once you could plan silently, others couldn't overhear your intentions. And that arms race between those who could conceal their thoughts and those who could detect concealment may have driven the evolution of more sophisticated social intelligence. Better lie detection, better reading of people, better understanding of what others are thinking without being told. Your inner voice, on this account, is partly a privacy feature, evolution's solution to the problem of thinking in public. And then there are the cases where the privacy breaks down entirely. In schizophrenia, many people experience what clinicians call auditory verbal hallucinations. They hear voices. For a long time, scientists assumed these voices were something alien, something separate from normal thought, entering the mind from outside. The current leading model says something more unsettling than that. The voices, in many cases, appear to be the person's own inner speech, generated by the same regions, using the same machinery, running the same process. But a self-monitoring system that normally tags inner speech as mine has broken down. The brain produces the thought, but it can no longer identify itself as the author. Experimental evidence supports this. When patients with schizophrenia hear recordings of their own distorted voices, they misattribute them to someone else at significantly higher rates than healthy controls. The words are theirs. The return address is missing. So here's where we are. You have a voice in your head, but it wasn't there when you were born. You built it slowly, out of words that came from other people: parents, teachers, strangers, the language of wherever you grew up. It runs for maybe a quarter of your waking hours, not the constant companion you assumed it was. Some people barely have it at all and move through the world just fine. And in some minds, the only difference between an inner voice and a hallucination is a single signal, a small tag the brain generates that says, "This is mine." The voice feels like the most private thing about you, the most intimate, the most essentially you. But the science suggests it's borrowed, intermittent, shaped by evolution to conceal, and held together by something so fragile that its absence is the difference between thought and a voice you can't turn off. If the voice in your head isn't constant, wasn't yours to begin with, and only feels real because your brain remembers to label it, what exactly have you been listening to your whole life?